The intersection of endurance sport, health, fitness, and life. Challenging conventional ideas and empowering people with the science of self-propelled motion. This is the Endurance Experience Podcast, hosted by Tony Rich.
At Penn State this fall, the fans are back. The sidelines are electric, but the game is different. After a U.S. Supreme Court ruling last year, college athletes are now allowed to earn money for things like autographs, social media posts, and endorsements through what's known as NIL deals, which stands for name, image, and likeness. Just this month, Nike announced NIL deals with 5 student athletes, including LeBron James's 18-year-old son. According to NCAA rules, schools can't directly offer money to recruit players, but so-called donor collectives operating independently of their respective universities can offer students NIL deals. Roman Bravo Young is a 2-time national champion wrestler at Penn State who chose to come back for a 5th year in part because of NIL deals, including with the local restaurant.
I can help out my family, take care of myself, because at the end of the day, wrestling is all I got. This is what I rely on, so it's cool that I can get money to help provide for myself.
The first returning guests to the Endurance Experience podcast, 2 economists, Dr. Jill Harris and Dr. Nola Agha. If you recall, they were my guests back in 2019 for episode 7, where we talked about the women's national team class action lawsuit. We had a broad conversation about the wage gap in sports and the pay between men and women in sports. That was a popular episode, and if you haven't had a chance to hear that one, definitely give that a listen. So I asked Dr. Harris and Dr. Agha to return. Much has happened in the last few years in this arena. There was the controversy about differences in access to resources between the men and women in the NCAA. That erupted early this year, and then there's always a healthy discussion about the wage gap in sports. And then that has bled over into the Brittany Griner conversations and athletes having to play in leagues outside of the United States just to support themselves. Now add in the name, image, and likeness ruling this year and the continued discussions about paying college athletes outright. We got a lot to talk about in the world of sport and equity in sport. So we cover an update on the women's national team class action lawsuit settlement and what it means for not only soccer but other sports. We talk about name, image, and likeness, and I asked the economists to provide their assessment on the ruling and what that means and whether or not they foresee any drawbacks. We talk about whether or not athletes should get paid outright for competing in college sports and what are the most frequent rebuttals to the argument that they should be paid. We talk about the 50-year anniversary of Title IX, and I asked both the economists what they think the legacy of Title IX will be and whether or not they feel we've made progress with participation in women's sports. Finally, I asked both economists the magic wand question, and that is, if they had a magic wand to implement any policies they see fit to improve the circumstances of sport, women's sport, or pay for sport, what would they do? These are 2 economists that have broad research agendas in sports economics, and in the show notes you can find links to some of the publications and research interests. as well as social media presence. Dr. Jill Harris is at the United States Air Force Academy, and Dr. Nola Agha, she is at the University of San Francisco, both professors. So, without further delay, I give you Dr. Agha and Dr. Harris. All right, thanks for coming back on the Endurance Experience podcast. I am on with Professor Jill Harris and Professor Nola Agha. Yeah, the last time we spoke, it was 2019, and that was episode 7, The Wage Gap in Pro Sports. It was probably one of my most popular podcasts. So I wanted to get you both back, my two favorite economists. And Professor Harris, you're at the United States Air Force Academy. And Professor Agha, you are at the University of San Francisco. And you're a sports economics consultant. And the last time we talked, you were assistant professor. Now you're a professor. Is that correct?
Time flies, doesn't it? I mean, thanks for having us back. But new university for Jill. I think you've moved since we started last time, and
I was just fresh here. But time has been flying.
Yeah, that's going on 4 years now. My goodness. Well, congratulations to both of you on that. So I want to talk about, again, so when we last spoke in 2019, we were talking about the U.S. Soccer Federation and the class action lawsuit. So I want to get an update on that. I understand it was a recent settlement, and I was hoping you might be able to unpack that for us. And then I also wanted to talk about name, image, and likeness. And this was a new ruling, NCAA ruling. And I want to talk about that. I want to talk about the conversation over potentially paying student athletes, and just get your thoughts about that, and also the 50th anniversary of Title IX. So why don't we jump right in with the class action lawsuit settlement? What happened there, and how can you sort of unpack the details of the settlement? Anyone want to start first?
I'll go ahead and jump in. It's like you mentioned, it was 2019 when we talked about this last. It was pre-COVID. It was pre these new settlements that the players' unions have had, and new collective bargaining agreements have been written and agreed upon since then. So lots has changed. Certainly, the gender pay gap, and especially in women's soccer, has been front page news in a lot of different places. And when the past concerns were that there was unequal treatment. And so what the women were paid for a friendly or for a World Cup was very different than what the men were paid. Mm-hmm. And not only was the men paid larger, but the terms of their contract was more generous. So they were getting paid for a tie, for example, where the women weren't. Mm-hmm. What happened with this new CBA is in some ways revolutionary. It required both the men's national team's player union and the women's national team players union to come together and to agree jointly on terms of employment. And this is unique because in Major League Soccer, for example, the players negotiate with that organization. And in the NWSL, the women negotiate with their organization. But with US Soccer, there's a single organization and there's 2 unions, 2 different genders. And so they had to come together and agree to terms. And, right. The high level is, of course, now for the first time ever, that the Federation, the US Soccer Federation, has agreed to provide equal rate of pay for both the men's and the women's national teams in all of their friendlies and in all of their tournaments, including the World Cup.
Right. It's going on right now.
And this is the first time. This is the first time that an organization has agreed to disentangle what an external organization, in this case FIFA, is paying them, and then taking that money which was very, very unequal between the men's and the women's tournament, but then turning it around internally and saying, well, listen, but we value all of our employees the same. They are all the very best at what they do, and therefore they should be, party to equal shares of this revenue that's coming into the organization. So in some ways, I actually think about it in two different forms. The contract was also about inputs. So what does this mean? These are obviously players, the best players in the United States. They're getting rewarded for the highest quality sporting performance. And in order, and I mean, Tony, you know this, you're an athlete, like in order to be the best athlete possible, you need access to the same infrastructure, which means the same hotels, the same flights, the same playing surfaces. You need inputs that are equivalent in order to be the best that you can be. And so now those inputs are equivalent. And so these players can now perform at the very best of their abilities. But now they're also getting rewarded for the output that's a function of, the support that they received up front. And so they are getting identical appearance fees, performance payments, game bonuses, sharing tickets and sponsorship revenue. And then, of course, this really big and most important part, which is sharing the pool, this equal percentage of what FIFA is paying.
That's definitely impactful. Dr. Harris, do you have anything to add there?
I think that there's some secondary effects, but this is, and I have to say this anyway. So when I am discussing anything in my sphere, I always have to issue a soft disclaimer that these are my views and not the views of the Air Force Academy or the United States Air Force. So, but I think that one of the kind of secondary spillover effects, which is very positive, is that it's helping recalibrate other conversations. Some might, at least initially, right after the settlement came out, some in the popular press were characterizing it as not a victory for the female athletes because they quote unquote didn't get what they asked for, that the courts had denied them, etc. But I think one player eloquently said it's a moral victory because even though it is a settlement and they didn't maybe get the precise dollar amount they asked for, everything that Nola just summarized for us indicates that it is this moral victory, that they have kind of recalibrated what is fair and equitable. And because of that, I'm thinking of the sad kind of revelations that are coming out of the Portland Thorns organization about the claims that the abuse complaints were ignored largely, and the ongoing fallout and conversations that are occurring in the media and occurring behind the scenes. Well, I think that story and I think the process that would surround these claims would be completely different if we hadn't had the settlement, if there hadn't been kind of a massive recalibration of this conversation about fair treatment, equal pay, and rights, rights of athletes of any gender when they suffer abuse. So to me, that's one of the. I mean, it's so new. It's still so fresh. This was only 4 or 5 months on after the decision, but I think that and hope that when these other thorny issues, kind of organizational issues arise, that the settlement is going to help stakeholders and people who are observing these conversations and reporting on these conversations to do so differently.
Yeah, you're right.
I think big win.
Yeah, it's a big win. And whenever there's a settlement, there's always a compromise on both sides. But I think you're right in that this sort of shed light on all of the abuse questions, but also Brittany Griner, right? And so it's sort of bringing up or shedding light on that issue because people are saying why was Brittany Griner even playing in the Russian league in the first place? Well, she was trying to get more money, right? So the WNBA, I think you cap out at something like $130,000 on average. Some of the more high profile players might get a little bit more than that, but it's something like $130,000 on average for a WNBA player. And so Brittany Griner was trying to get more money, Though they were getting a million point five to play in that league. And so, all of it is sort of shedding light on these same issues, how these pay issues are going to get resolved. Something else that came up since we last talked was the name, image, and likeness ruling by the NCAA. And I wonder if you can talk about this. What does this mean for collegiate athletes, male or female?
That conversation with an anecdote that might provide some context. And I think you were privy to this too, Nola. I think we were both on the board at the same time. But before the Alston v. NCAA case decision was announced by the Supreme Court, the NCAA actually had I'm not sure if it was an employee, but it was at least a consultant, reach out to an organization that Nola and I belong to, the North American Association of Sports Economists. And they were this person, this agent, if you will, was actively pursuing us to see if we wanted to provide input to the NCAA about how best to set up a name, image, and likeness program if the NCAA was going to try to manage it, get out in front of all of the states who were passing legislation, and somehow keep a foot in the door to try to manage or administer some type of NIL process. And I wasn't in a position of power to actually kind of be negotiating on this question, but one of the decision makers did share this story after the fact. And so there have been some conversations with economists and at least this one agent of the NCAA about how best to do this. I don't think we had committed fully to any type of contractual relationship, but we know for sure that they had reached out to us. Literally within weeks of that event happening, the Supreme Court comes out and says, effectively, and I'm not a lawyer, but if you read the decision, especially the comments at the end, the NCAA effectively said, look, NCAA, you can't do business the way that you have been doing business. And that decision specifically has to do with the payment of additional educational benefits. I want to be very clear. That decision wasn't about name, image, and likeness specifically, but it was about payment for additional educational benefits. But the writing was on the wall. And as soon as that decision came out, every conversation or the efforts surrounding some kind of collaboration just immediately evaporated. And the NCAA just backed off. They knew that what metaphor is appropriate. The dam was breaking, and there was no possible play for them anymore to try to kind of get in front or stay in the game in terms of trying to manage or control name, image, and likeness. So I think that anecdote is really telling. The significance of name, image, and likeness, there's tons and tons of examples. Listeners can Google, they probably have their favorite story about a top athlete, a top recruit, and what they were promised, what kinds of contractual arrangements came their way. But my initial takeaways about name, image, and likeness are this. I think that on balance, it's good. We'll maybe talk more about this when we talk about paying college athletes. More income, more compensation for an athlete who up to this point, at least the D1 level, is kind of signed away to their school, the potential revenue from their image, the potential revenue from their performance, the fact that now it's legal in most states for these athletes to benefit either now or in the future if they're going to bankroll those payments, however it's going to be set up. I think that's a good thing. Economists generally feel like input should be paid, for their contribution to the company profits. So I think it's good. I still think, though, even though I'm very pro athletes receiving more of the income they generate, I think it still presents some really thorny principal agent problems.
Yeah.
And we're seeing some one example may be, I think it was Brigham Young that was one of the first schools to actually just kind of present their new recruits with contracting opportunities literally the moment they came in through the gymnasium door, the AD office door. They got out in front and were kind of putting themselves in the position of the agent, representing the students' interests and kind of contracting in advance for them.
Right.
There are other programs who have hired, or they may not have hired a new staff member, but they have appointed a staff member who is just going to be the agent, in fact, for athletes, representing them in these deals. And in the classic kind of principal agent problem, you have mismatched incentives.
Right.
And so it's not clear to me in the stories that I've read that that athletes, that name, image, and likeness is a completely positive change. I think a lot of the devil is going to be in the details of how these payment arrangements are worked out.
So I'm an athlete. Basketball or football. I want to make money off my name. Maybe I created a logo. Maybe I have social media platforms, and I contract either with the school or a third-party agent to represent me as sort of like a scout, a sports agent. And then they take a cut of any time my name or brand is on a T-shirt. Is that how it works?
It's kind of a mess. Yeah. They're theoretically or in practice, I guess and so what we're seeing is, because there's no official regulation, that it's actually happening in different formats in different places. And so I think the way that people initially envisioned it is that there'd be some sort of open market, and that a company who was interested in a player's platform and the size and the reach of their platform would contract with them directly. And so that it really would be this maybe pure sense of an athlete monetizing what is just truly theirs, and that they could work directly with organizations that were wanting to do that. And so that's, of course, why we see that most of the deals are done with men's football and men's and women's basketball, is that they have the largest platforms. So in some ways, the companies that have entered into this space are reflecting what's already existed in the market, which is those are the three sports that are promoted the most. Those players in general already have the largest platforms. So it's a very rational move for a lot of these companies to approach the athletes in those three sports. But, to your question, we're actually seeing differences. So like Jill was just saying, sometimes we've got college athletic departments that are inserting themselves in this process.
Right.
Now we have booster groups that are inserting themselves in the process. And that is, of course, the worst case scenario that people were concerned about, is that this would be used to essentially pay athletes to move fully into a model where we can pay you as much money as we want, now sort of above the table, but we'll just call it name, image, and likeness. And so we're seeing the whole spectrum of what should theoretically be perfect and versus what's probably the worst case scenario for people taking advantage of the system.
Yeah, I sort of have the same. I mean, on the one hand, I can see this could be very lucrative for some athletes, particularly, what gets the most attention? Football, basketball, right? What about field hockey, right?
Right.
Well,
there's definitely exceptions, so there are athletes who have outside of those three largest sports that have developed really amazing social followings, and those are extremely valuable. And those athletes, some in gymnastics, and actually there's a lot of great deals in track and field, volleyball, soccer, softball. So we're seeing rare but large deals there for athletes who already have an established fan base that they can monetize. The vast majority of the deals, though, are on those three largest sports.
I
Interesting.
add that when news that I think one of the first couple of states approved name, image, and likeness legislation, I just looked it up. Chloe Mitchell is a freshman volleyball player at Aquinas College, but she was a high school volleyball player who had, this story in Forbes said, 26,000 followers on TikTok, 5,400 fans on Instagram, this type of thing. And she had already kind of developed the platform, was set up to kind of capture all this income. On the margin, athletes like this may not ultimately be able to support themselves through the income they're able to earn as an athlete. But I'm imagining she probably could use that platform to maybe get recruited by a better quality program or school than she might have otherwise, right? Because they know that if they recruit an athlete, other things the same skill level, that has a platform, that they're going to free ride on that athlete's social media presence. So I'm imagining we're going to see more and more stories, or hear more and more stories about athletes who, they're not making $1 million deals, but they may have gotten into a more prestigious program, and from that platform maybe had a chance to be pro, maybe not. These are the types of ways I think that the big cash isn't going to be for all athletes, but the marginal kind of benefit of playing at a better school and having a little more of the marketing limelight could make a difference, especially for athletes like Nola mentioned that are in some of the other poorer.
Yeah. And you sort of see some of this, or have been seeing some of this already. I mean, athletes are putting up social media platforms, and not only athletes, but what they call content creators, putting up platforms, YouTube channels, TikTok, gaining followers, and then monetizing it. And so that model is looking like it could be potentially a viable stream of income for a college athlete, but also third-party businesses will start to come in and start to come with my firm. I'll help you with the best name, image, and likeness strategy, and get your name out there. I'll just take a cut though I'll just take a small percentage of whatever it is that you're getting, right? So this is interesting, and I'm looking forward to seeing how this evolves. Now, how does this play into, and maybe we can go into paying student athletes outright. So every time we have conversations about paying student athletes, some people think it's really simple. They're like, we should just pay athletes for playing sport. What's the big deal? All of these colleges are making so much money. Why don't we just pay athletes? What do you think about this from where you sit?
So, full disclaimer, I'm biased about this. I'll just say it. Now, I can walk through very objectively what the literature in sports economics has to say about pay for play. Surprisingly, the preponderance of the literature supports paying for athletes, or at least supports loosening the monopoly power and the monopsony power in the input market that the NCAA has, which by default then means ultimately more of the revenue that is earned from that market power would be shared with athletes in some fashion. So, I'm biased in my personal opinions, but a little bit of the research that I've contributed to this conversation, and the vast majority of the research, kind of points in the same direction. So why is that? Why am I biased, and why is the literature mean that way? Well, in general, economists generally favor more competitive, market-oriented solutions to any type of industrial organization. There are problems of inequity. There are problems of inefficiency, quite frankly. Sometimes we end up pouring money into firms that aren't making a great product, that aren't profitable. There's a myriad of reasons why economists tend to favor market-oriented outcomes. One of the reasons we favor them is that, in general, when markets are competitive and allowed to operate, the inputs that we started this conversation with, like labor inputs, generally will earn something close to the revenue that they are responsible for helping to generate in the productive process. It's not always true, but it's more true in competitive markets than it is in markets where there's a lot of monopoly power.
Mm-hmm.
In general, economists favor paying college athletes. Now, there's, I have to give a shout out to Andy Schwartz. He's done and worked with a colleague of Nola's, Dan Rasher, through their consulting firm. But Andy's done a lot, probably most of the testimony before Congress on the issue of pay for play has come from Andy or Dan or one of their colleagues. And Andy has beautifully summarized all the reasons that people typically use to argue against pay for play. And I want to revisit all of those. But chief among these reasons is usually some argument about, but they're amateurs. College athletes they're getting a free education, and to pay them for playing football or volleyball or whatever they're playing for their school is redundant, because they're already getting this, free scholarship, and it would destroy amateurism. It's actually kind of two myths rolled into one. And the deal is, Tony, is that we can't prove that until we try, right? Yeah. And in fact, one could say that's a reason for allowing more liberal pay for play policies to be experimented with, so we could, collect some data and answer some of these common complaints. The Supreme Court decision in Alston is important because it begins to challenge some of the claims that have been unchallenged, really, by other courts in the past. And it has to do with this amateurism claim. Basically, the NCAA has always successfully argued that the reason they have to retain control of the revenue streams and not pay athletes is that the only thing that distinguishes them in the market for sports consumption from the World Cup, from the Super Bowl, from anything else that's going on, is that amateurism makes college football different. Yeah. Amateurism makes the track and field contest more exciting, and that their fans demand it. So they use this kind of product differentiation argument historically and for the courts. And you know what? For whatever reason, the courts have bought it up until now, or they haven't been willing to challenge it. But this Alston decision is kind of putting everyone on notice that product differentiation claim is flawed. Yeah. And that the NCAA may not be able to hide behind it anymore. Well, so I could go on and on, but I don't want to garbo the mic. But it's I'm all for pay for play, and I think that some of the downsides and some of the arguments that are made, we really can't answer until we experiment with some type of pay for play.
Yeah. Well, there was a basketball player. He wrote an op-ed for the New York Times. Cody McDavis, former basketball player, and went on to law school after playing basketball. One of his arguments was that it would create a power vacuum, right? So people think that the universities make so much money, but after looking at maybe say 350 D1 schools, he was saying that there's only really a small number, 20, maybe 25 out of 350 plus. Only 25 really are profitable, right? And so if those 25 were to pay athletes, it would create a power vacuum. Everyone would go to Notre Dame and Michigan because they could pay for it, whereas some of the smaller schools may not, and sort of create this power vacuum.
Hi everyone, my name is Cody McDavis. I play Division I men's basketball at the University of Northern Colorado, and I'm currently a law student at the UCLA School of Law. And I think that paying student athletes would ruin college sports.
Paying athletes would distort the economics of college sports and hurt student athletes, universities, fans, and alumni. A few big sports programs would pay top dollar, but other sports programs will get caught up in a bidding war they can't afford. If that ceiling is lifted, that'll create a winner-take-all system. A handful of top recruits will receive paychecks, But athletes in other sports like soccer, swimming, and gymnastics might never get a chance to compete in college.
But I think what you're saying is market forces would have to work through that. Or is that a valid argument?
I want to back up and just kind of a point of order thing on it. This is a common misconception. There's a great book by Rod Fort and Brian Winfrey, 15 Myths and Why They're Wrong. I might have gotten the title wrong, but among other of our colleagues, they've kind of done a deep dive into university finance. And one of the reasons that the op-ed writer came to this conclusion is that accounting rules sometimes force schools to break even, right? They have to expend all the revenues that are earned. And so that can kind of put a finger on the scale when you're trying to figure out, well, which schools are profitable, which schools would be able to afford higher talent. So I just wanted to throw that out there as a point of clarification. But Nola, I'm curious about your thoughts.
Well, I think it's interesting, Tony's question about it. What's this power vacuum and what's going to happen? And the reality is that it has to reach a new equilibrium. The equilibrium that it's in right now is one, but that doesn't mean it's the best one. So what do I mean by that? We have all these schools who are paying their coaches tens, hundreds of $1 millions a year, right? Sometimes the most highly paid public employee in a state is the football coach. Yeah. And that's just because that's the state of being doesn't mean that's the best state of being. So if things did have to change and if they landed in a new place, that wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. And so I actually think it goes back to 2 points that Jill made earlier, which is it's about industrial organization and it's about marginal revenue product. So how do we organize this industry? Right now, it's organized on free labor and really highly paid coaches and some generally accepted accounting practices that make it look like you're not making any money. And so that is the current equilibrium. And if that changed, we will also, in terms of industrial organization, remember that the NFL doesn't have a development league. They rely on universities to be their development system. And so you've got this $1 billion sport brand that sort of piggybacks on this whole financial model in college to train and develop players that can then move on to the best, American football league in the world. So there's a bizarre system in place right now. And there's certainly, I think a lot of people think, looking at it from the outside, some room for improvement in how that industry is organized and how those connections are organized.
Yeah.
And then the other part is the marginal revenue product, which is how much are you earning? And so I know Jill was involved in some research and looking at female basketball players in college and how much are they earning? And if you look at their tuition, are they being overpaid or underpaid? How much are they generating and how much are they getting back? And, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was well over 50% of athletes were generating more money than they were receiving back in tuition. And I did a very similar study just recently with one of our colleagues, Dave Barry, looking at softball athletes in college. And it was the exact same story. So the majority of women's softball players generate more money for their university than they receive back in tuition. And of course, there's all sorts of nuances in state tuition, out-of-state tuition fees, what are really counting in there. And of course, it is really difficult to truly find out what are the revenues of an athletic department because they do have so many ways to sort of change their numbers. We looked at 2 different forms of revenue and the conclusion was actually the same on both. So the idea is that there are a lot of sports where athletes are being, let's say, underpaid if you assume that this scholarship is their form of payment. Now, the other end of the scale is when you look at this, I think most people, when they talk about paying athletes, they're imagining men's football, men's basketball, and maybe women's basketball, because those are the sports that are promoted the most, that are currently valued the most, that are generating the most. And there's this argument from universities that, even if you don't buy the amateur myth or the amateur argument, that there is something about, certainly at the D3 level, athletics just being part of our social and our emotional development as human beings. You go to university and you broaden your mind and you broaden your physical activity, and that it's part of becoming a complete human being, that not all sport at all levels was designed to be profit generating. And so there is certainly, I believe, and this is sort of just my opinion, some room for differentiating those different levels. Is Division I different than 2 and 3? And on most measures of anything computational, the answer is yes. And it's very, very different. One's profit seeking. I mean, we just saw 2 universities in California decide to join an East Coast conference, right? You've got college athletes that are going to be taking 6-hour plane flights to New Jersey in order to compete and then somehow come back. And that's not about educational objectives, right? That's about maximizing profits. So it's not an easy answer because there are different levels of, a D3 school that's playing other schools in the state. They're not trying to generate profits. A school that's flying across the country to get higher television revenues, they are. So there's no perfect outcome, but I absolutely do believe there has to be some sort of new equilibrium as we're moving towards paying athletes more and more through room and board and fees and now name, image, and likeness, and this whole evolution towards them generating more money.
Interesting. So you don't buy it's an amateur sport.
It's some
I don't
levels.
think I buy that either.
Yeah.
The power vacuum one, I believe you when you say that the revenues and expenses of the colleges are different than what they show, because companies do this all the time. But if Notre Dame and Michigan has the biggest pockets, then if I'm a basketball, football player, I'm going to go to whoever has the biggest check, So I don't know. I think that's the one that I question the most, whether or not it will create a power vacuum. And if the money is going to go to football and basketball, what happens to swimming and baseball and everything else, lacrosse,
Yeah, and that opens the door for some sports being paid, and maybe acknowledging that, for football, for example, is the minor league system. College football is the minor league system for the NFL. Acknowledge it. Just say, listen, we are training these athletes. We are expecting them to be somewhere 40 or more hours a week. Let's just call it what it is. Let's pay them for their service. And maybe there's swimming, and maybe there's track and field, and maybe there's water polo, and maybe those are designed to be part of the educational mission of the university, that is just being about a student, and that those aren't designed to be profit maximizing. So I think you can certainly also have 2 systems within the same university.
And do you foresee something like some sort of, I find this could open the door to another sort of equal pay argument, right? So someone who starts gets paid more than someone who doesn't play, perhaps, or how would you work out that?
Well, like you would in the professional leagues, there's minimum wages. Like the NBA has a minimum wage, Major League Baseball has a minimum wage, and sometimes you sit on the bench, but you're still a very important part of that team if somebody gets injured or you need to be there for practice. And so there will always be a spectrum, I think, of payment depending on your talent and your ability.
It sounds like you got an algorithm worked out. Maybe you two can get together, write a paper, publish it, and then it'll be talked about first here.
It's complicated.
Okay.
It's complicated.
Well, we'll see what happens with this. Is there pending litigation here out there for this? Is there any pending rules or pending court cases or anything for this? Or we just have to keep a lookout and see how it evolves?
I won't be able to name the cases for you, but there's at least 5 or 6 cases that have been slowly going through appeals and making their way through the system. And when the Alston v. NCAA news broke, people on both sides of the aisle, or both sides of this issue, will pay close attention to how the rest of these cases, because remember that the Supreme Court decision was about this very narrow question of compensation on educational benefits. Some of these other cases have to do with broader issues of outright pay, kind of like, think about the O'Bannon decision which was a name, image, and likeness question about being paid for the back pay for the misuse or the use of their images without their permission in EA Sports games. So there are other cases that are pending, but I'm not an attorney, and we have colleagues that are in sport law and entertainment law. One of my colleagues here said it'll be years before these things, finally kind of are adjudicated through the courts.
Yeah.
So I'm not holding my breath. I once said, famously to my husband, in my lifetime, I hope that, I'm proven right in some of my research, and the NCAA is kind of disbanded because it's no longer necessary. Now, that's an extreme statement. The NCAA, in its original function in terms of safeguarding health and other forms of abuse, will probably still have a function.
Yeah.
But in terms of being, the monopolist and the monopsonist on the labor side that it is, it would be remarkable to see a structural change in that organization in my lifetime. But I'm kind of old, so I don't know.
Yeah, we'll see. Okay. All right, let's go into, we're finishing up 2022, the 50-year anniversary of Title IX. And I wanted to get your thoughts on the legacy of Title IX. Do you feel we've made progress with participation in women's sports and in colleges or high school? And do you both have daughters, or no?
I do.
Both have daughters, right? Okay. Then what do you think is the impact of Title IX? Who wants to start?
Hands down, access to opportunity. That's at its core, that's what it was. It opened the door to hundreds of thousands of women to be able to participate in a sport as soon as Title IX was signed. The NCAA and a lot of other organizations have done some big reports around this 50th anniversary of Title IX. And the report that I saw from the NCAA said there's 3.4 million female high school athletes that are eligible to play college sports now. Now, only 218,000 of those actually did. And it's an interesting way for the NCAA to I think, position that, because in some ways, first time I read that, I felt like, oh, are they criticizing the women that didn't decide to play, college athletics? It kind of felt a little wrong when I read that. But then some of the other studies that have come out around the anniversary of Title IX, the Women's Sport Foundation, for example, what they found was that female athletes have 80,000 fewer opportunities to play in college than men do. And so depending on who's doing these studies, you get a very different story, because what we're seeing now is, even though women have more opportunities, the way that college athletics is supported from an institutional basis is actually still very uneven. There's more athletic opportunities for men. There's more investment in men's sports than in women's sports. And that's in terms of scholarships. Men receive most of the recruiting money. Male coaches of male teams get paid much more than coaches of female teams. These are all management decisions. Yeah. And so even though women have been brought into, and we've said, listen, there's all these opportunities for you, the management and the institutional story and message to women is like, you can come and play. We're just not going to treat you the same as the men. And in fact, we're going to teach you worse than the men. So it's a really interesting way to think about where Title IX has got us. It's opened the door, but we're definitely not sitting at the same table.
Yeah. Dr. Harris?
Yeah. Again, I'm kind of harkening back to some of the work that Burton Winfrey did. I think part of the disconnect in what Nola described is that people in the business, people in the industry, coaches, athletic directors, sometimes university presidents, misrepresent what Title IX is making them do. Title IX has never dictated that there would be, for example, a necessity for equal dollars spent that oftentimes when decisions, and we saw this especially during the COVID period, when there are decisions about when revenues get tight or budgets are being cut, oftentimes decision makers hide behind or make the claim, and maybe they're making it because they believe it's true, but they'll make the claim that because of Title IX, we had to cut this sport, this sport, this sport, and they'll act as if Title IX placed a budget constraint on them, and the legislation doesn't do that. It is about access, as Nola described. So I think that conversation, that soundbite, that headline in decades of reporting is people believe it's true. They just believe that it's true, and I know both Nola and I have on and off taught versions of a sports economics class or in sport management. I'm sure it comes up all the time with your students too, Nola, that our students think it's true. Like they just kind of believe that that's what Title IX, that was one of the effects of Title IX. So there's more work to be done in terms of deconstructing the narratives around what Title IX requires of institutions and what actually kind of gets done at institutions in the name of Title IX.
Yeah, it goes back to, in some ways, what we were talking about with the U.S. Soccer Federation, which is the decisions that they had made to prioritize men and to center the men's team and to provide them more opportunities and to provide them, if you tie, you get paid, whereas the women get tied, you don't get paid. This decision to constantly provide more for men in these very subtle ways. And so a really good anecdote is that, I don't know if you guys heard about this, but DePaul University, they added a $1 fee to their men's basketball ticket. And the $1 fee was called the Women's Athletic Advancement Fee. Okay, so the predictable response from fans was, of course, being upset, which is great. Now I'm being fined for wanting to watch men's sport. Okay, so now what they've done is increase hostility towards women's sport, which already exists at some level, but now they've increased it by adding this fee onto a men's ticket, which they didn't have to. The decision maker could have just allocated more of the budget for the department to the women's team, right? They didn't have to put a fee onto it. So that was a conscious managerial choice, right? To propose that. And Dr. Lauren Hindeman, the fantastic gender scholar, what she said, and this is a quote, and I love it. She said, "It furthers the ideology that women's sports need the charity of men's sports to exist, while ignoring that gender inequity is in part a result of people choosing to invest in men's and not women's sport." And that's really the core of what we're talking about here. Mm-hmm. It's a choice. It's a management decision.
Right. Yeah, I can see how that $1 fee service charge wouldn't go over well. We both, once again, have been very generous. Let's finish up and give you your magic wand, right? I think this is a good way to end. If each one of you had a magic wand and could just employ any solutions with anything that we talked about, the next time, part 3 of our podcast, next time, in 4 more, 5 more, 10 more years, or whatever it is, what would you employ as a solution if you had unlimited capabilities to implement anything that you wanted?
This is such a hard question, but I'm going to sound like a broken record, sadly. I honestly feel that, and this is a function of where our research interests have been, but I honestly feel like so much of the inefficiency, inequity, exploitation, maybe even abuse of other kinds would be minimized if we would just allow markets to work the way they're designed to work in, especially amateur athletics, but in professional athletics as well. So what my example is, without throwing wholesale these organizations under the bus, I've done some research in the area of swimming and aquatic sports. And FINA, in some ways, serves the same function as the governing body of soccer. Mm-hmm. It's the worldwide kind of governing body for swim, and they got into some hot water and with a class action suit several years ago because they were prohibiting elite swimmers, Olympic swimmers, from wanting to participate in something called the International Swim League, which was a swim for pay organization. And so what's at the heart of that league, that class action suit? Well, it's monopoly power. These organizations, you might not think of top of mind, what's the most exploitive organization in all of sport? FINA. Like, no one's going to say that. But in this, I think that's why it's a really great frame of reference, because even an organization like FINA, even an organization like USA Gymnastics, again, these aren't the high revenue generating sports generally at the D1 level, they have this complete control over the participants in this market. And we've shown in some published work and some work that's going to be published soon that, again, there's a large swath of swimmers that are not generating more revenue than they are paid in terms of the stipend that they get from their support organization like FINA. But a lot of athletes are.
Right.
And I think that for a culture, Western culture, all cultures, I think, kind of prize sport and all of the great things that we all love about it. But especially in the United States and in Western culture, where sports, I mean, we spend billions on sport. I'm just surprised that we settle for arrangements that are, as we have described them this entire hour, so unbalanced, that we settle for an equilibrium that in the sports industry that we would never allow to happen. Say, although we do allow it to happen in higher education. Help me, Nola. We allow it to happen. If it was happening in other parts of society, people would be up in arms protesting in the streets, right? But we just allow it to happen in sport.
Yeah.
And if I had a magic wand, I would be able to kind of allow markets to work, allow competition to flourish, so that these kind of market power organizations would have less power.
Yeah. Interesting. All right, Dr. Agha, what would you do with your magic wand?
Well, I definitely agree with Jill that in sport, we see this combination of monopsony and monopoly power, which just makes it a really challenging environment for there to be healthy equilibriums. But for me, I actually think it's a little bit more on the idea of, investment in decision making. I always think about the former Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She said, women belong in all places where decisions are being made. And it shouldn't be that women are the exception. And in sport, women are still the exception in places where decisions are being made. And so that's from professional leagues, that's at universities. There's very few women at the athletic director position in colleges and universities. And so that's when you see these decisions that are made, like the $1 fee on the men's basketball team. It was a terrible decision. It doesn't benefit anyone, really, at the end of the day. And so I think if women were in those places of decision making, you would have a healthier perspective. I also just think about what we saw during COVID, when there was enormous success from the WNBA and the WSL. They were finally shown on television. And then overnight, everyone was like, this is fantastic. I would love to watch it. Okay. But for years before that, there was no decision maker on a broadcast network that was like, we should put these on television. Maybe people would really like this. The decision makers instead were like, nah, nobody likes it. Right. And so we actually find that now that there's been these amazing opportunities for women to have the spotlight, there's enormous demand. And of course, marketing is just generating demand. And so what if we were to market men's and women's sports identically? What if we were to invest in them identically? What if we had identical effort, I guess, at least to promote women's and men's sport, whether it's apparel companies, whether it's media companies, whether it's the investors, the amount of money that each is receiving. If we had just that identical effort on both sides, I think we would see an enormous shift in what sports are popular, what sports are profitable, and therefore how people are being paid and treated in those organizations.
So
Nola,
much.
she has a better wish. I give my wish to Nola. I give my wand to her.
I like both of them.
I do too.
Wow, that was great. And once again, you red pilled me on pay for play and NIL. I'm coming out of the other side, on your side, more than I was when I started the podcast. So that's the same thing that happened the last time we talked. So thanks. If you can let everyone know where you can be located out on social media.
Sure. Yeah. And so first of all, thank you. I love having conversations with great minds. It's been really fun to do this. You can find me anywhere on the web. I'm actually the only Nola Agha on the planet, as far as I can tell. So if you Google my name, you'll find my email address at the university. You'll also find my Twitter handle. I'm at Nola Agha. Most handles, most locations, I'm Nola Agha because I am the only one.
That's great.
Similar fashion, I was an early Twitter adopter. So I am an @Jill Harris. On Twitter, and socially, that's probably the easiest place to engage. I do have a profile in the faculty directory at the United States Air Force Academy as well, but Twitter's the best place.
Yeah, you were the first mover on that Twitter handle, and so now that you have to pay your $8 fee for your, you can get verified on it very easy.
Well, go ahead and pick that up for me, Tony. You go ahead and pick that up for me.
All right. Thank you both for coming on to the podcast.
And thank you for having us.
Thanks again, Dr. Jill Harris, Dr. Nola Agha, my two favorite economists. My goodness, they always do it to me. They always make me think, and then I come out of the other end, moving a little bit on where I was at the beginning. So that's the sign of a great conversation. And hopefully I can have them back in the next 4-5 years and see where we are at that point. So in the interim, please go out and follow them on social medias and check out the links in the show notes. Thanks again. This is the Endurance Experience.
Follow Event Horizon Endurance Sport on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter for training programs and services. To become a member of our Endurance Institute or for a complete archive of podcasts, log on to our website, eventhorizon.tv.